Hey everyone, welcome to the OklaRoots YouTube channel and welcome to month 5 of the OklaRoots block party. So if you're following along live, this is July, so happy July! I feel like this is starting to become kind of like a vlog series as well as a block party for the year 2020. I hope everything's going well wherever you are. A lot of you guys know that I am out here in Florida where things are getting a little crazy, so I'm just hunkering down in my sewing room, sewing everything, all the things. So I'm okay. I'm good. I'm happy. I'm happy to be here with you guys today. So I'm gonna show you the block first, and then we're gonna talk about it just a little bit before we dive in and do the tutorial. So this is our block for month 5. Now you can see this is super scrappy. Does anything go together? No, but it's so bright. It's so cheerful, which is exactly what I need right now. Month of July, summer, hot, lots of yellow. Makes me super happy. So this is one version of the block I made. Here is more of like a, planned out version of the block using a lot of pinks and reds. And I just want to show you guys my solids only version of this quilt that I'm building alongside my scrappy version. And then this is it. So you can see this block is really fun. It's very geometric, just a bunch of rectangles, a couple triangles on the corner. The one thing about this block that's gonna make some of you guys say, no, I don't wanna do it, is we're using partial seams. Now, partial seams just means you don't sew the entire seam. It means you leave some of the seam on an end unsewn so that you can go back later and sew it to another piece of fabric. It's kind of like this weird little puzzle where you gotta do pieces 1 and 3 before you can sneak piece 2 in there. If you make bags, you're probably totally unfazed by this. In bag making, we do this all the time, right? We have to leave sections of a seam unsewn all the time so that we can sew it later. But for some reason, for quilters, a lot of quilters are just like, I don't want anything. When I sew a seam, I want to go from beginning to end, and I want to be done. I don't want to go from beginning to 3/4 of the way and then come back later and do the 1/4. I don't want to do that. I want to go beginning to end, done, move on to the next step. So I want to show you how easy partial seams are. And if you're looking at designing your own quilt blocks, you'll see that once you kind of get comfortable with partial seams, you can design a bunch of other quilt blocks and quilt designs and have less limitations to them. So once again, this is the block we're making today. In the video, I will be making a scrappy version. I will be using templates. I'm not using the Cricut Maker today. If you have a fabric cutting device, you're more than welcome to go onto my website. On my website, I will have the PDF pattern that has the templates for this tutorial, as well as an SVG file that you can download onto your computer, put into your cutting machine software, and then the machine will just cut it all for you, because how awesome is that? Also, I just want to remind you that when you go to my website to download anything, everything is free. There will not be any sort of pop-up anywhere asking you for a credit card number. If you get that, it is an advertisement. Don't put your credit card information in. Everything on the website is free. So if you're new to the channel, please consider clicking subscribe down below. If at any point you like this video, please give it a like. Any questions, comments, anything you want to say, put them down in the comment section of this video. If you're making these blocks and sharing them on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, anything like that, make sure you use the hashtag OklaRoots Block Party so I can go find it and see what you guys are doing. I love seeing that the community is really paying attention to what everybody else is doing and getting these really great creative ideas on how to mix it up. You guys know how much I love when you take the pattern, totally change around the contrast in the design, and make a block that's totally unique. I absolutely love seeing that. All right, let's get started. So for the block pattern today, I'll be using 5 different fabrics. In the design, I have it designed using 5 different colors, but as always, you are more than welcome to switch it up in any way you like. When you go to my website, you can download the PDF for month 5. There you can print off the templates for this month's design. On the templates for any rectangles, I do have the measurements. For the long rectangle, I do have a tip to extend it just a little bit, and we'll talk about that in the cutting step. When you're printing off the templates, make sure you're printing them from Adobe Acrobat Reader. That is a free piece of software for your computer. It'll open up your PDF for you, and you want to print it off at 100%. That's going to make sure that these print at the exact size. I do have the sizes marked on the templates as well for any rectangular pieces. I wanted to mention a few tools before we got started. When piecing quilt blocks, I like to use pins instead of those clips. My thread of choice is Aurifil 50 weight. I like to use a thinner needle, so a 7010 Microtex or Universal works really, really well with our thinner fabric. And then I always like to have my stiletto on hand, especially because my machine tends to kind of eat the fabric. A stiletto really helps you keep that thin fabric in place while you're feeding it through. So I've had a few questions about this in previous months, and I wanted to address it real quick. When you're prepping your fabric, I do suggest you spray it with some sort of a starch. So I like to use Best Press. There's lots of different options out there. Lightly spray your fabric and then press it. And you do this before you cut out your pattern pieces. I really don't like to use any sort of starch on my fabric while I'm piecing my quilt block. I'll use it on the very end, but when piecing my quilt block, I like to have as little moisture as possible touching my fabric because I find that it will kind of crinkle up or warp. So use your starch and press your fabric well before you cut out your pattern pieces. So on the templates, I have it marked how many you're going to need and which color you're using. It's a good idea to kind of label your colors, especially if you're trying to keep the whole quilt with just using 5 colors. I like to just trace around my templates on my fabric. All of these templates are equilateral, so it doesn't matter if you trace it on the front or the back of the fabric. I know a lot of people have a personal preference of tracing on the back side of fabrics. So whatever you're comfortable doing, just trace around your templates and then grab some scissors and just cut out your traced pieces. So we're going to use the same method to cut out the pattern piece for our triangular corners. Another option for these corners is to just cut out 2 3.5-inch squares and then cut those in half along the diagonal. That will also give you the same triangular shapes, except you won't have these notched rounded edges. I do find that the notched edges help line everything up as you're building the quilt, but if that's something that you don't need, then just make 2 squares that are both 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches, and then cut along the diagonal. All right, so once you have these pieces cut out, you can go ahead and put them to the side. And now let's work on our rectangles. Now, you don't need to use the templates. You can just use a regular ruler and a rotary cutter. Let's start with the squares. So 2 of your squares will be from the same fabric as your corners, if you're following the pattern. I like to cut out a 5-inch by 2.5-inch rectangle first, and then you can just cut this in half to have your 2 2.5-inch squares. All right, once you have your 4 squares cut out, you can go ahead and put these to the side. And now let's talk about the rectangle. These rectangular pieces are what we'll be using to make our partial seams. The required size for each rectangle is 6 inches by 2 inches. If you have a tendency to struggle with your seams and things being too small or too big, I do suggest instead of 6 inches, let's go ahead and change this to 6.5 inches by 2 inches. And then we can trim it down to size as we sew it. So if you don't need to do that, just do 6 inches by 2 inches, you'll be great. If you want to incorporate some room for error, make this 6.5 inches by 2 inches. That's what I'm going to be doing, and I'm going to show you how you can use that to your advantage when building this block. So for this cut, I like to cut a rectangle that's going to be 6.5 inches by 4 inches first. And then, keeping the 6.5-inch length, I'm going to trim the 4 inches down into 2 inches and 2 inches. So I'm just halving the 4-inch height here. And there we go. Now I have my 2 rectangular strips. Go ahead and do this with your other piece of fabric. So now you should be done cutting your block pieces. Let's go ahead and build this out to see what we're working with. So here is most of my block laid out. If you have any changes you really want to make here, now's a good time to do that. If you're just not feeling the colors on the center of the block, take those out, use them for another project, replace them. But if you're good with your layout, we're gonna build this block from the inside out. So the first things we sew together are the inside, the last things we sew together will be these corners. So go ahead and spread out your pieces so that you're just working with those 4 squares in the middle. And for these squares, all we have to do is pick 2 adjacent squares, lay them right sides together, just like this, and then pin in place if it's helpful. So now we're going to take these to the sewing machine and sew along these pinned edges at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. You'll notice that I have a scrap piece of fabric that I sew through first, and then I sew my pieces of fabric. This helps you avoid your sewing machine eating the corners of your fabric. When we're using just quilt cotton, it's so thin and light that our needle can just push down that corner of fabric into our machine, and then the gears get a hold of it and it's a whole mess. If you have that feeder piece of fabric first, just a scrap piece that you sew through first, don't cut the thread, and then sew this on, you won't have that problem. So when pressing these, it's a good idea to have the same piece of fabric wrong side up. So you can see I have like this darker fabric and this lighter fabric. On both of them, I'm going to have the darker fabric wrong side up. And I'm going to press my seam behind that darker fabric on both of them. By doing it the same way on both units, you're going to be able to nest the center corners in a really nice way. I'll show you. So make sure you give it a nice press on the back as well to really hold that seam in place. So this should be what you have. Now we're just going to connect these 2 units together, right sides together. Remember, the fabric pieces should be opposite of one another. And then when you fold them right sides together, you can see your seams go in opposite directions. So all you have to do is just hug that center seam together, and you'll have that perfect point in the center of your block. I like to pin that middle first and then line up the edges and pin out. All right, now let's take this to the sewing machine and sew a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance along the pinned edge. And once again, just press this seam open. You can press it behind either side. Now this center unit should measure 4.5 by 4.5 inches. If you didn't want to use these 4 squares and you had a nice bigger design that you really wanted to have in the center of your block, you're going to cut that to 4.5 by 4.5 inches. So what I like to do is I like to take my ruler and just square this up. Ideally, you should be able to line up each center seam on the 2 1/4 inch marks on your grid lines. So 1, 2 1/4 inch should go on the seam going up and down, and then 2 1/4 inch should go on the seam going horizontally. If your center unit is a little bit smaller than 4.5 by 4.5 inches, that means your seam allowance is too big. All right, so now we're going to build out around this and we're going to start working on our partial seams. Grab the top and bottom rectangles. You'll notice they go off the edge of the square unit in opposite directions. So this is not right. This is right. So starting with the top unit, we're going to lay this right side down. Now remember, if you're following me, I made these rectangles 1/2 inch longer than they need to be. That means I can have my rectangle go off the side on the right just a little bit if I need to. Now you don't have to do this, but if you want to make sure this really lines up perfectly, you can have it go off the edge about 1/8 inch, just a scotch. All right, and now we're going to pin this down onto that center square unit. So on the edge where your rectangle is overhanging the square unit, we're going to put a pin that's about halfway in between this square. And that's going to be our stopping point mark. So when we're sewing, we're going to sew along the edge that's flush with the square all the way to that halfway mark between the other square, close to the overhanged edge. We want to stop there. Let's do the same on the bottom. Pin the bottom up, right sides together. You can let it overhang just a touch and we can trim it down later. Starting at the flush edge. And then I like to add another one right on that center seam. And then a third pin halfway through the square that's close to the overhanging edge of my rectangle. Okay, we're gonna sew along these pinned edges at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Remember, we want this part of our square, close to our overhanged rectangle, to be unsewn. We want lots of space here. You can backstitch here if you choose. So now lay your unit down with the wrong side of the long rectangles, wrong side up, and we're going to press the seam behind these long rectangles. Now here, only press where there are stitches. So this edge right here, just don't even worry about pressing this all out. We're going to deal with that later. Only press where there are stitches. If you had a little bit of overhang on these flush edges using your long rectangles, you can go ahead and trim those down now. So what I do is I just line up a grid mark along the seam that's partially sewn with that rectangle, and then make sure the edge of my ruler is lined up with the edge of my inner square, and then I'll just trim this down. You might be wondering, why did we have this overhang at all? For me, it's because sometimes at the sewing machine, my pieces can shift a little bit, and I have found that even when I line up this top rectangle with that square perfectly, whenever I'm done sewing and pressing it, it's just a little bit in, and it drives me crazy. So if you don't have a problem like that, then by all means, don't let it overhang. But I purposely make my pattern piece bigger so that I can do that, because I'm not always perfect. All right, this is looking great. Now we're going to attach the other rectangular pieces, and they're going to go just like this. So fold the unsewn flap of your already sewn rectangle out of the way. Line up this vertical rectangle, right sides together, matching it up along the edge of your bottom rectangle, and then along the side of your square unit. Should go just like this perfectly. Once again, you can let this overhang just a little bit to avoid shifting at the sewing machine. Now we can just pin these together, and this time pin it along the entire edge. If you have a good amount of overhang right here, that's okay. We're going to trim that down later. All right, so it should kind of look messy like this. Let's go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. So on this bottom rectangle, I'm just going to pull that flap out of the way. I'm going to take my last rectangle and lay it right side down, lining it up along this edge with the edge of the rectangle and the edge of my square unit. And then I'm just going to pin the entire piece down. Again, any overhang down here is fine. We'll trim it down in a bit. So this should be your unit right now. You have your flaps out of the way, and you have the other rectangles completely pinned down. We're going to sew along these pinned edges completely at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now lay your unit with the rectangles wrong side up. We're going to just press down this seam. Make sure you keep those flaps from the other rectangles out of the way. And I like to just press the seam behind those rectangles just because it's easier. So this should be what you're left with right now. And I know you're probably like, this is a mess. What are we doing? We're good. Move that flap once again out of the way. We're just always moving it out of the way. If you have overhang like I do, we're going to trim this down now. If you did not cut your rectangle at 6.5 inches long, but instead you cut it at 6 inches long, you should be pretty perfect right now. So once again, I'm just going to line up one of my grid marks along this seam with the rectangle, line up the edge of my ruler right along the edge of my center square, and then just trim off the excess. Let's do this on the bottom as well. Be very careful when you do this that you don't cut the other rectangle right here. That would be sad. All right, go ahead and lay your flaps down. Now we can just finish up this unit. I'm going to rotate this so it's a little bit easier for me to work with. With my rectangle with the flap on top, I'm going to fold this down, and I'm just going to line up this unsewn flap with that edge of my square unit and the rectangle already attached. If you find that you have a lot of pull right here because of your press seam, you can iron this flat first and then pin it down. Otherwise, just pin it down. Now I'm going to rotate this to do the other side. So once again, I'm going to fold this rectangle right side down, line up that unsewn edge with the square unit and rectangle that are all sewn together, and then just pin that unsewn edge. Now all we have to do is sew from our stopping point previously and continue that scant 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way to the end of the rectangle. All right, this is where we should be. Now all we have to do is press that remaining sewn edge right behind that rectangle, and it should all fall together very nicely. You can give the whole unit a nice quick press, and there you go. See, that's not so bad. So this finished unit should measure 7.5 by 7.5 inches. You can see I have some overhang here that I need to clean up. If you have one of these handy Creative Grids rulers, now's a good time to use it. It'll just help you clean up this rectangle. So what I'm doing is making sure my 7.5 inch grid marks on the side and the bottom are encompassing most of my block. If your block is a lot smaller than 7.5 by 7.5, once again, that means that your seam allowance was just too big. So I'm just going to trim it up on those edges first. Move the scuff out of the way. Rotate my block. And then line up my 7.5 inch mark on the side and on the bottom with the left side and the bottom of my block so that I have a nice neat square, and then just trim it up again. So that is the hardest part, and if you have done this, you see it is not that challenging, and this offers such a fun layout for all kinds of quilt block ideas. The rest is just smooth sailing. So let's grab our remaining trapezoid pieces, and we're going to just add these on opposite edges at a time. So I'm going to do the top and bottom first, move the sides out of the way, lay one unit right side down against the edge of your square, and then just pin this in place. Now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and sew along these two pinned edges at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you have those sewn on, you can just press along those seams, and I like to put the seam allowance behind that trapezoid. Next, we're going to use our side pieces and sew those on. So if you have those little notches, they should line up pretty perfectly. If they're a little off, that's okay. You're more focused on making sure that this unit lines up with the square underneath rather than the edges of the top and bottom pieces that you just sewed on. Go ahead and pin that in place, and then repeat the process on the opposite side. All right, let's go ahead and sew these on at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once again, let's go ahead and press these seams behind the new unit. Whenever I'm pressing, I'm using very delicate fingers. I'm not trying to stretch my fabric in any way. I'm just very lightly pushing everything down. I'm going to go ahead and press the back as well a little bit. All right, we just have to attach the corners and we are done. So grab your 4 corners and we can attach all of these at the same time. So lay the corner right side down. So those notches on the corner should line up just perfectly with the edges of your rectangle if you use the pattern pieces or an automatic cutting machine. If you used a square and then cut along the diagonal for these corners, you will notice that these edges go off the edge about 1/4 inch. Just go ahead and pin all 4 corners in place, right sides together. So now let's take this to the sewing machine and sew along each of these pinned edges at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. These are your final stitches. Once you have your corners sewn on, all we have to do is just press those seams, and I like to press them behind the triangles because it's just easier. And you can see with this block, it's really fun because you have a lot of these corners, but because we build it inside out, and because everything just kind of nests together, you get these really, really great points without the same amount of effort that it would take to get those points otherwise. You know, if you're piecing a lot of small pieces together, it could be a struggle to get those points matching up like that. But because we go inside out, I can't wait to see your guys' blocks. All right, so when you're completely done with your block, you can give it a very, very light spritz of starch on the back side, and then just go along all the seams and press them. This is going to just really flatten out those seams, and it's going to make it easier for you to build your quilt later. Well, that turned out lovely, didn't it? This is one of those quilt blocks that you don't really know how it's going to look until you're completely done with it. When you're picking out your fabric, it's just really hard to visualize it. So it's a bit of a surprise in the end. All right, so once you're done with your block, you can go ahead and grab your 10.5-inch template by Creative Grids, or you can go to my website and you can print off some units to create your own template. And then I pretty much just center it and hope that it all is enclosed by the ruler. Again, if it doesn't measure up to size, that's fine. We can fix it later. I am not a perfectionist quilter. And there you go. There's your block. It's beautiful. All right. What do you think? How did you like it? Yeah, that's beautiful. I love these quilt blocks. They're just so stinking pretty. All right, we did partial seams. Is this the best way to do partial seams? I have no idea. I have no idea. If it's not, go ahead and check the comment section, because I promise you, those who feel there is a better way to do this will have commented down below letting you know. So go check the comments section. Let me know, how do you like the block? Did you make it? Did you try it? How do you feel about these partial seams? Honestly, if you do know of better ways or other video tutorials showing a more efficient way to do this process, feel free to leave them in the comments section. I always appreciate the extra information. I know the rest of you guys love reading that and getting tips on how to do it in other ways. We're at month 5 right now, guys. So next month, we'll be halfway through our block party. Yikes. It feels fast, but it also feels kind of slow. I mean, that's 2020. 2020 feels like it's going by really fast, but then it's also like, oh my God, this is the longest year of my life. I know a lot of you guys can relate with that because we've been talking about this. Many of you and I have been chatting about this. So next month, we're going to start talking more about what do we want to do with our quilt top. With this quilt top, you could just take all of the blocks, sew them together, bam, you're done. Or we can start adding some sashing. I will be adding sashing to my quilt top, and I'm going to start cutting the pieces for that sashing next month. So in month 6, we're going to do the block, and we're going to cut the pieces of sashing for our finished quilt top. I feel like that's a great time to do that. I know that summer isn't quite as busy for many of us as it normally is. So let's just chop up that fabric for our sashing, or at least start thinking about what we want to do with our sashing. Let's get that done now, put it to the side, so that way, towards the end of the year, towards the beginning of 2021, when things might be a little bit busier for us, we don't have to worry about that step. We'll already have it there. Put it together. So I hope your year so far is going great. I know, just like me, we're all making the best of it. You all are absolutely incredible. Your positivity, your sincerity. I couldn't ask for better friends. Honestly, I'm just so happy to be doing this with you guys. I'm so happy to be doing life with all of you guys during this year. I honestly don't know how I would have gotten through 2020 so far without this incredible community. If you're not a part of our Facebook group, go check us out. We're the OklaRoots Creatives over on Facebook. Nicest people in the whole world are in that group. I promise you, they really are. I hope you have a great rest of the week. Get out there and make something. Bye, guys.